In the caves near Qumran, among the brittle remains of the Dead Sea Scrolls, fragments of the Book of Enoch survived in Aramaic. They established something important. Enochic traditions were circulating in Judaism centuries before the medieval Ethiopian manuscripts that preserved the complete work. And inside that ancient cosmology, heaven is not an empty sky. It is structured, bounded, and divided. But the central claim needs precision. First Enoch describes the firmament and the architecture of heaven, yet it does not plainly say, the firmament was created to separate the waters. That explicit purpose belongs to Genesis 1:6-7, where the expanse divides waters below from waters above. Enoch takes the investigation somewhere else. It describes the firmament as part of a cosmic boundary, linked with the winds, the extremities of the earth, the courses of heavenly bodies, and regions humans do not normally enter. That distinction is the key. If Genesis gives the act of separation, Enoch imagines the world after that separation has been imposed. Above is a regulated heavenly realm. Below is the inhabited earth. Between them stands a boundary that is part of an ordered universe. Yet three problems remain. What exactly did Enoch's writers mean by firmament? What lay beyond it? And why are certain beings shown crossing boundaries that ordinary humans cannot? The surviving fragments do not answer all three at once, but the next clue is hidden in where Enoch is taken. The place Enoch is taken belongs to the oldest major section of the work, usually called the Book of the Watchers, now preserved as 1 Enoch 1-36. The surviving evidence comes through several languages and periods. Aramaic fragments from Qumran Cave 4, including manuscripts catalogued as 4Q201, 4Q202, and 4Q204, show that portions of Enoch circulated in the Second Temple period, much later. The complete form of 1 Enoch survived in gaze within the Ethiopian Christian tradition. Greek fragments also preserve parts of the work. That transmission history matters because the Book of Enoch is not a single manuscript written at one moment. It is a collection of Enochic compositions preserved through different textual witnesses. The Qumran fragments confirm the antiquity of important sections, but damaged fragments do not preserve every sentence found in the later complete Ethiopic text. For the question of the firmament, the crucial movement begins in 1 Enoch 17-19. Enoch is carried beyond ordinary human geography. He sees places associated with winds, celestial fire, mountains, waters, and the extremities of the world. In 18:6-8, the text describes enormous mountains and a place where heaven appears to reach its limit. The scene belongs to an ancient cosmology in which different regions of creation have appointed boundaries and functions. This is not yet a technical explanation of Genesis 1, it is a visionary map. And that difference prevents an easy mistake. Enoch does not merely repeat the biblical creation account, it expands the imagined structure of the cosmos, placing Enoch at locations no ordinary observer could verify. What he encounters there makes the boundary above the earth more than a surface separating waters. It becomes part of a guarded cosmic order, with appointed places, limits, and passages that certain beings can cross. That crossing becomes explicit in the same visionary journey. In 1 Enoch 18, the text describes Enoch reaching the ends of the earth, where he sees the treasuries of the winds and the foundations of heaven. Then the vision turns darker. Beyond those ordered regions, Enoch is shown a place of confinement associated with stars that have failed to keep their appointed course. The text states that these stars are bound there because they transgressed the command of the Lord. In the following chapter, the interpretation sharpens. The imprisoned stars are identified with angelic beings, and their punishment is connected with rebellion. The language is symbolic, but the structure is clear. Creation has assigned places, assigned movements, and assigned limits. To violate those limits is not presented as a minor disturbance. It is cosmic disorder. That is where the firmament becomes significant. In Genesis, the expanse separates one region of creation from another. In Enoch's visionary world, boundaries continue that same logic. The heavens contain gates, courses, storehouses, extremities, and zones that beings are expected to respect. The text does not say that the firmament itself was constructed specifically to imprison angels. That conclusion would go beyond the evidence. But Enoch does portray the cosmos as a system in which separation and obedience are closely linked. The scene is easier to picture if we imagine an ancient city with walls, gates, districts, and roads. The comparison is only explanatory, not evidence. Movement is possible, but not every being belongs everywhere. And then the problem deepens. The watchers of 1 Enoch 6-16 do not merely observe humanity from above. They descend, take human wives, and cross a boundary between heavenly and earthly orders. Their offense is described in moral and sexual terms, but also in spatial terms. They leave the heavenly realm assigned to them and enter the human world in a way the narrative treats as forbidden. Later judgment does not simply punish what they taught or whom they married. It addresses the breach itself. The crossing of an appointed cosmic limit. If the cosmos was designed around separation, what did their descent actually violate? The answer appears earlier in the narrative, in a speech attributed to God himself. In 1 Enoch 15, Enoch is sent to confront the watchers, and the accusation is more precise than simply saying they descended from heaven. The text contrasts what they are with what humans are. The watchers are described as spiritual beings who belong to heaven. Human beings, by contrast, are mortal creatures of flesh and blood. The text states that women were given to human men so that human life could continue through offspring. The watchers, however, were not assigned that same earthly condition. Their union with women therefore violates more than a command about behavior. It collapses a distinction between two orders of creation. That makes the earlier journey to the edges of heaven more important. The gates, courses, foundations, and appointed regions are not merely scenery. They reflect a cosmos organized by boundaries. Heavenly beings have a proper realm, humans have another. The narrative treats disorder as beginning when those categories are crossed. Then comes an even stranger consequence. According to 1 Enoch 15:8-12, the giants born from these unions die, but something of them remains. The text identifies the spirits proceeding from their bodies as evil spirits that continue to afflict the earth. This is an Enochic explanation for the origin of destructive spirits. It is not a claim established by archaeology or science, and the Dead Sea Scrolls do not prove that such beings existed historically. What matters here is the logic of the text. A forbidden crossing produces a hybrid generation. The destruction of that generation does not restore the original order cleanly. Instead, the breach leaves a residue inside the human world. The firmament, then, is part of a larger ancient idea. Creation remains stable when realms, beings, and appointed functions stay within their limits. But if that is the pattern, one question becomes unavoidable. Was the firmament only meant to separate regions, or was it also understood as part of a system designed to keep different kinds of beings apart? One small word now carries more weight than it seems. In the Ethiopic text of 1 Enoch 15, the watchers are contrasted with human beings by category. They are heavenly and spiritual, while humans are earthly and mortal. Modern translations differ in how closely they render the language of spirit, flesh, and heaven. That difference matters because the argument is not simply about location, it is about identity. Some translations make the contrast sound almost biological. Others emphasize status and proper dwelling. The surviving Aramaic fragments do not preserve every line of this speech clearly enough to settle every nuance, so caution is necessary. The complete wording depends mainly on the Ethiopic tradition, checked where possible against Greek and Aramaic witnesses. But the implication remains striking. If the watcher's offense is understood only as descent from one place to another, then the problem seems geographical. If the text is instead distinguishing kinds of beings, then the violation is deeper. Beings assigned to the heavenly order cross into a human mode of life that the narrative says was not given to them. That makes separation more than architecture. It becomes a principle governing where beings belong, how they move, and what forms of union are permitted. The firmament in Genesis divides cosmic regions. Enoch's Watcher's story extends the logic of separation into categories of existence. Yet the text never states that the firmament itself was created specifically as a barrier against angelic human unions. That would be an interpretation, not a quotation. A minor translation choice therefore changes the scale of the question. Is Enoch describing a wall between places or a boundary between orders of creation? And if the second reading is closer, then the firmament may be only the visible edge of a much larger system of separation. That larger system becomes clearer when modern manuscript study enters the investigation. Today, scholars do not examine Enoch by asking only what the complete Ethiopic text says. They compare surviving witnesses in Aramaic, Greek, and Ge'ez, study handwriting styles, reconstruct damaged lines, and track where different textual traditions agree or diverge. Paleography helps estimate when a manuscript was copied by comparing letter forms with other dated or datable texts. Textual criticism asks a different question: which readings are likely to preserve an earlier form of the work? This matters because the physical evidence is fragmentary. The Aramaic manuscripts from Qumran confirm that substantial Enochic material existed in the Second Temple period, but many passages survive only in pieces. A torn edge can remove a verb. A missing line can erase a transition. A later translation can preserve a passage that no longer survives in its earlier language. So the modern investigator works backward from damaged evidence. When the Ethiopic text describes heavenly gates, appointed courses, and divisions between cosmic regions, scholars can compare those ideas with the fragments that survive from earlier periods. Agreement across languages can strengthen confidence that a concept is ancient within the Enochic tradition. Disagreement can reveal transmission history, but neither result proves that the cosmology describes the physical structure of the universe. That distinction is essential. Modern manuscript imaging can sometimes recover letters too faint for the naked eye, and reconstruction can clarify how a damaged fragment should be read. Yet no imaging technology can photograph the firmament itself. The tools can test the age, wording, and transmission of manuscripts. They cannot verify the supernatural geography the manuscripts describe. What they can establish is more limited, but still significant ancient Jewish readers were engaging with an ordered cosmos in which boundaries, heavenly movement, and forbidden crossings mattered deeply. This does not prove that such boundaries physically existed. It proves that the idea was old, structured, and preserved in texts centuries closer to the Second Temple world than the medieval manuscripts alone would suggest. And once that antiquity is established, another problem emerges. How did later Jewish and Christian traditions decide what to do with a book that described those boundaries in such extraordinary detail? The answer was never uniform. In ancient Judaism, Enochic writings clearly circulated, and the Qumran manuscripts show that at least one Jewish community preserved and copied them. But survival at Qumran does not mean universal acceptance. The later rabbinic canon did not include First Enoch, and the text gradually disappeared from most Jewish manuscript traditions. Early Christianity tells a different story. The letter of Jude, verses 14 to 15, contains a prophecy attributed to Enoch that closely parallels 1 Enoch 1:9. That does not prove that every Christian community treated the entire work as scripture, but it shows that Enochic tradition was known and could be used authoritatively. Several early Christian writers also knew the book, while others questioned texts outside the developing biblical collections. The strongest continuity survives in Ethiopia. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church preserved 1 Enoch in Ge'ez as part of its broader scriptural tradition. Because of that preservation, a complete form of the work survived when Greek and Latin transmission elsewhere became fragmentary. When European scholars encountered Ethiopic manuscripts in the modern period, the book re-entered wider academic study not as a newly discovered composition, but as a text that one Christian tradition had never lost. This history is often described too simply. There is no evidence that the Council of Nicaea removed the Book of Enoch from the Bible. Canon formation was gradual, regional, and uneven. Different communities preserved different collections, and texts could lose influence without a single decree ordering their destruction. That matters for the firmament question because interpretation traveled with transmission. Communities that no longer read 1 Enoch directly encountered Genesis without this elaborate Enochic map of heavenly gates, boundaries, and rebellious beings. Communities that preserved Enoch retained a much fuller imaginative framework for those themes. So the conflict is not between a hidden truth and an official erasure, it is between different histories of reception. One tradition preserved the cosmic architecture in detail, others moved on without it. And that leaves a present-day mystery when we reconstruct Enoch's ancient cosmology from manuscripts that survived so unevenly. How much of the original picture are we still missing? That missing picture is not only a matter of lost pages, it is a matter of surviving fragments. The Aramaic copies of Enoch from Qumran are incomplete. Some passages exist in multiple witnesses, while others survive only in the later Ethiopic tradition. Scholars can compare wording, reconstruct portions from context, and identify where earlier textual forms probably stood behind later translations. But reconstruction has limits. A gap in a fragment is not a blank space that can be filled with certainty. For the firmament question, that limitation matters because the most elaborate descriptions of cosmic boundaries are not preserved evenly across every language. The surviving evidence confirms that Enochic cosmology is ancient, but it does not preserve one perfectly continuous Aramaic blueprint of heaven. This leaves several uncertainties open. Did earlier forms of the text describe the same heavenly structures in exactly the same way? Were some details expanded as the work was transmitted? Do differences between Aramaic, Greek, and Ethiopic witnesses reflect translation choices, textual development, or simple damage? Scholars can sometimes answer parts of those questions. They cannot answer all of them. And the physical fragments themselves impose another boundary. They can tell us that particular words were copied, that particular passages circulated, and that particular compositions existed by a certain period. They cannot tell us how every ancient reader understood the imagery. So the present-day mystery is not whether the Book of Enoch mentions a structured heaven. It clearly does. The harder question is how much of that structure belongs to the earliest recoverable form of the tradition, and how much may reflect the long history of transmission. The fragments preserve the map, but not every line of it. And what disappeared with the portions that did not survive? Now, an important distinction is necessary. The physical evidence does not prove that a literal firmament exists above the earth. The Dead Sea Scroll fragments prove that Enochic writings circulated in antiquity, and the Ethiopic manuscripts preserve a complete form of the work. They give us manuscript history. The textual evidence shows something different. Genesis describes an expanse separating waters above from waters below. First Enoch describes a cosmos arranged through gates, courses, appointed regions, heavenly beings, and forbidden crossings. It also portrays the watchers as leaving their proper heavenly condition and entering the human world. Those are claims made by ancient texts. Interpretation begins when we ask how those claims fit together. Some readers see the firmament as part of a broader system of cosmic separation, not merely a divider of waters. On that reading, the Watcher's story becomes an example of what happens when boundaries between heavenly and earthly orders are violated. Other readers would separate Genesis more sharply from Enoch and warn against importing Enochic details back into the creation account. The evidence does not force either conclusion. Speculation begins when we go further, claiming that the firmament was specifically engineered to imprison angels, prevent hybrid beings, or function as a physical security barrier. No surviving passage in 1 Enoch states that directly. But the pattern remains difficult to ignore. If Genesis is correct within its own ancient cosmological framework that the expanse establishes separation between realms, and if 1 Enoch's repeated language of appointed places, heavenly order, and transgression reflects an expanded theology of those boundaries, then the larger question becomes whether separation itself was understood as one of creation's fundamental protections. That would make the Watcher's rebellion more than disobedience. It would make it a breach of cosmic classification, heavenly beings refusing the limits that define their place in creation. Even then, the conclusion must remain conditional. Manuscripts show us what ancient communities wrote and preserved. They cannot independently verify the supernatural world those texts describe. Yet the investigation has narrowed the mystery. The firmament may not be presented in Enoch as a prison wall, It is part of something more comprehensive, a universe held together by distinctions. And if those distinctions fail, Enoch's world suggests that the consequences do not remain in heaven. Back in the caves near Qumran, the surviving fragments remain silent objects, torn pieces of ancient manuscripts carrying portions of a much larger Enochic world. They do not show us a physical firmament. They do not prove that watchers descended, that heavenly gates opened, or that cosmic boundaries can be crossed. What they prove is narrower. Ancient Jewish scribes copied Enochic traditions in which creation was ordered by appointed places, divided realms, regulated movements, and consequences for beings who abandoned their proper station. Genesis gives the firmament its basic function, separation. First Enoch does not rewrite that creation scene so much as extend its logic into a universe where boundaries govern more than water and sky. They govern movement, identity, and the difference between heavenly and earthly orders. That is why the Watchers matter. Their descent is not evidence that the firmament failed. Within the narrative, it is evidence that beings can rebel against the order defining where they belong. And the fragments still exist, not as proof of the cosmos they describe, but as proof that ancient people were asking what held creation together when its boundaries were crossed. If separation was part of that order, what did they fear would happen when it no longer held